On Wednesday, Senator Dick Durbin called for the passage of the Respect for Marriage Act, citing the concerns of a constituent who was in a same-sex marriage. The Illinois Democrat said that the Supreme Court's overturning of Roe v. Wade had ignited a legitimate fear among LGBTQ Americans and their allies that the rights of same-sex married people could be rescinded. Durbin, along with all Democratic senators and 12 Republicans, would later advance the legislation. It is widely expected to pass the upper chamber and be signed into law by President Biden. The Respect for Marriage Act ensures that same-sex marriage and interracial marriage will not be overturned by the Supreme Court.
The senator from Illinois.
Are we in quorum call?
We are not.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, my office recently received a message from a woman named Amanda. She lives in Illinois and in the Chicagoland area. She tells me that she and her wife, Callie, will be celebrating their 5th anniversary as a married couple. The two of them have actually been together for 8 years, but after the Supreme Court's 2015 decision in Obergefell, they decided it was time to tie the knot. That ruling affirmed their love and, just as important, their constitutional right. The court declared that the right to marry is a fundamental liberty under the Constitution for every American, regardless of sexual orientation. So in 2017, Amanda and her wife, Kelly, exercised that right, and today they're the proud parents of 2 beautiful young children, a daughter, Austin, and a son, Ren. Really, that should be the end of the story. With Obergefell, Amanda and her wife were guaranteed the same rights as me and my wife. And it should be the beginning of a new story. A loving couple who can now focus on their family and taking care of the day-to-day responsibilities, paying the bills, feeding the kids, navigating life as working parents. But sadly, Amanda and many others are now living in fear. Like millions of Americans, she's facing the very real prospect that this Supreme Court could soon rule that her right to marry the person she loves is not protected by the Constitution. She saw what this radical far-right Supreme Court did with the Dobbs decision just a few months ago, the decision that erased the constitutional right for the women of America to make their own reproductive health choices. And now she and Callie are wondering, will they come for our rights to marry next? Amanda wrote to my office, quote, Justice Clarence Thomas, in his concurring opinion in Dobbs, wrote that the court should reconsider all of this court's substantive due process precedents, including Griswold, Lawrence, and Obergefell. She said, quote, for the first time in our history, Americans are facing the continued loss of civil rights by this Supreme Court. Our 2 young children are growing up in a world where they may, in some cases, have less rights, fewer rights, than their parents and grandparents. Amanda tells me she and her wife are taking every legal step they can do to ensure that our recognition as parents to our children cannot be challenged. This is emotionally and financially taxing, she said, and yet we feel we have to do it. There are more than 700,000 married same-sex couples in America. Couples like Amanda and Callie, whose love and legal status were recognized under the law and protected by a Supreme Court decision in Obergefell. Couples who, along with their friends and families, are demanding the Senate do what we should have done years ago, codify marriage equality. We can put their minds at ease before Justice Thomas and the far-right majority even have a chance to rip away yet another fundamental freedom. And this is not an abstract exercise. Early next month, the Supreme Court will hear oral arguments in a case called 303 Creative LLC versus Elenis. It's a case that apparently is concerned with free speech, involving a website designer in Colorado who wants to build wedding websites, but with a disclaimer that proudly announces she will not build websites for same-sex couples. She sued the state of Colorado, demanding the right to boast about her plans to discriminate against LGBTQ Americans. Such a disclaimer would violate a state civil rights law, which prohibits businesses from discriminating or intending to discriminate against someone on the basis of their sexual orientation. If the Supreme Court's last term and the Dobbs decision are any indication, this radical, far-right majority on the court could very well use this case to start the erosion of protections of LGBTQ Americans. It's exactly the kind of judicial activism we've come to expect from this court's conservative majority. Remember when they boasted about the fact that Donald Trump was going to put on 3 justices who would rule his way in future cases? It was pretty clear from that day forward that the Supreme Court had a political bent. The Federalist Society had to give its stamp of approval. Now, the Federalist Society is a multi-million-dollar political arm of the Republican Party. And before any judicial nominee had a chance in my Senate Judiciary Committee under the Republican days, they had to get the approval of the Federalist Society. The Federalist Society from the start was setting out to eliminate a woman's right to choose. They had their victory in the Dobbs decision. But the American people spoke on November 8th, and overwhelmingly they said across America, you can't get away with eliminating rights already established under the Constitution for any Americans. I hope that that sentiment grows, and eventually we reverse the Dobbs decision. What we've seen is exactly the kind of judicial activism we can come to expect from the court's conservative majority. They twist the law and set aside longstanding precedent to establish the policies they prefer. But it's not the Supreme Court's role to make the laws. How many times have we heard that speech from Republicans? We don't want judicial activists, they say. That job of making the laws belongs in Congress. And today we can defend families like Amanda's by voting for the Respect for Marriage Act, which passed just a few months ago here on the floor of the Senate with a strong bipartisan vote. It will protect marriage equality under the federal law, not just for LGBTQ couples, but also interracial couples, whose rights could also be in peril by the court's far-right majority. The issue of marriage equality is too important to get bogged down in partisanship, which is why this bill is a bipartisan compromise. I hope that getting 60 votes for the Respect for Marriage Act is going to be an indication of more cooperation to guarantee that Amanda and Callie do not have to lose sleep over the future that they have as loving individuals married to one another and parents. In last week's election, the American people sent a clear message to Washington and to the Senate. Get it together. Work together. No more toxic culture wars. No more divisive rhetoric. No more big lie. Enough. If you want to stand for family values, let's start by enacting protections for every family in America. We can do it certainly with the Respect for Marriage Act and even more. To Amanda and Callie, I'd like to say happy 5th anniversary. I hope by the time your 6th anniversary comes around, you won't even have to think twice about whether your rights are secure. Madam President, I ask consent that the next statement I make be placed in a separate part of the record.
Without objection.
Madam President, as we head into the holiday season, parents and doctors nationwide are concerned about a dramatic surge in an illness called RSV, respiratory virus. It can be especially serious for children and older Americans. As a parent, there's no more terrifying or helpless feeling than knowing that your baby's sick. I know. I lived it. Caitlin Berg experienced that fear recently, too, when her 6-month-old daughter became ill with RSV and was struggling to breathe. The Bergs live in Mount Zion, Illinois, a small town downstate near Springfield. Caitlin Berg scoured the area looking for a hospital that would cure her sick daughter. After many frantic calls, she finally decided Springfield was the closest town with a hospital. She took her baby there and waited 8 hours in an emergency room before a bed finally opened up for her daughter. Caitlin Berg, incidentally, is a pediatrician. If a pediatrician has to struggle to find hospital care for her own sick infant, imagine the panic and fear other parents feel when their babies are struggling to breathe because of RSV. And it isn't just a problem in small town or rural America. Chicago is the 3rd largest city in our country, some of the best hospitals in the world, including some of the very best children's hospitals. The rate of emergency room visits for young children with RSV is now 10 times higher than in 2019, 10 times higher than a normal season 3 years ago. This chart demonstrates that. Look at this spike. As you can see, the number of children admitted from RSV is skyrocketing. In Chicago alone, there are hundreds of new cases each week, and nearly a dozen kids each day being hospitalized. Earlier this month, Comer Children's Hospital at the University of Chicago was full with no beds for 53 straight days. And Lurie Children's Hospital in Chicago also running at full capacity. 95% of pediatric ICU beds across Illinois are full during this time. This crush on pediatric hospitals isn't limited to Illinois. Over the border in Franklin, Indiana, little Ophelia, you can see here in the bed, struggled to breathe after contracting RSV at preschool. She went to the local hospital and they transferred her to the large children's hospital in Indianapolis, where she was intubated for 5 days. Thankfully, she's home safely now and recovered. Across the country, children's hospitals are being pushed to the limit, caring for infants, toddlers, and young kids sickened by RSV. In extreme cases, kids and babies may require ventilators to breathe. The timing of this surge in RSV is especially concerning, coming during the worst flu season in a decade and while new COVID variants are circulating. Those 3 viral variants together pose what many health professionals argue could be a triple-demic of viral illness. So let's look for solutions. The Children's Hospital Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, has asked this president to issue an emergency declaration to free up more resources. I support them. At the top of the list, America desperately needs more nurses, more doctors, more staff. Hospitals plagued with worker shortage even before COVID now have a pandemic that's made the crisis even worse. If our children's hospital had more staff, they could immediately open more beds to treat the kids. Congress made some headway in the American Rescue Plan, which passed on the floor of the Senate without the support of a single Republican senator. It included my provision to invest $1 billion in the National Health Service Corps for scholarships and loan repayments for new nurses and doctors who serve in urban and rural areas in need. But we need to do more than end the healthcare worker shortage. Senators Menendez, Bozeman, and Schumer have a bipartisan plan which I support. It increases funding for medical residency slots to train the next generation of doctors, nurses, and other medical professionals. I support putting that plan in the end-of-the-year package we'll consider in the next few weeks. It's also critical that we fund our public health system adequately and provide for data collection so we can track RSV. The Health Committee has been working on this priority, and I certainly support their efforts. Madam President, we're all in this together. The hospitals are doing their best. Doctors and nurses are working extra long shifts to keep kids safe. We all need to do our part too. For all of us, that means staying home when we're sick, still washing our hands, getting COVID booster and flu shots. For those of us in Congress, it also means providing the resources to get safely through this current surge of RSV and building the strong public health infrastructure which American families require. I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum. I yield the floor.
The senator from Tennessee.
Thank you, Madam President. I have spoken repeatedly